don't know if you've noticed this, but I would say in the last maybe 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 years, I've noticed more criticism of the Constitution maybe than any other time, at least in my adult life, where people are kind of stepping back and kind of pointing out some things that maybe it didn't get right. And so I just wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe offer what you think the Constitution's greatest accomplishment is, and what you think maybe the greatest weakness is of our governing framework, or a
Yeah.
few.
So that's tough. So I'm just going to go with my immediate response, Denver. And
Yeah.
as I reflect, I do all my best thinking at 3 a.m. So at 3 a.m., I'm sure I will have a much better answer to these questions. I think the ability, the capacity for expansion is has enabled the Constitution to continue to be the foundation of our country across tremendous change. So if you think about that exercise we had about raise your hand if you can vote now or vote in the 18th century, I mean, those are two wildly different worlds. But we still are operating under the same fundamental structure. When we get to the Constitution, we'll talk about the ways in which it's been changed structurally and also culturally, but the core remains the same. And then when I think about the limitations of the Constitution, I think about like a house, right? So a house is built on a foundation, and you can knock down walls and raise another floor up and expand off to the side. You can paint, you can upgrade the lighting, but the foundation is controlling and defining in some ways for the house. And the foundation of our government was built on racial privilege and racial exclusion. And so there has been room to expand beyond that, but we still have in some ways the same foundation. And it has been extraordinarily hard to change that. Even again, we have, but a lot of people have sort of suffered and died in order to make that happen. So I guess those are my two immediate thoughts about the strength of the Constitution and then its shortcomings.
Well, that's pretty good. Your 7 p.m. self is as brilliant as your 3 a.m. self.
No, at 3 a.m. I'll say, why did I say that? Why did I say that?
And we have had a few great questions come in. And we'll start with one from Lee, who just asked about the issue of term limits, which conveniently actually came up in the document that you shared with us. But you want to talk a little bit about that and how they thought about, they called it rotation in office, right? Is that
right? So within the states, there were term limits, and within the Articles of Confederation, there were term limits. So I believe you can correct me because you heard all of Woody last week, but I believe that to serve in the Confederation Congress, you could serve no more than 3 out of every 6 years. And so the thinking is representatives should go back to their locale. They should learn about what people on the ground need, and they should not create sinecures of power. So if people were allowed to be in office too long, it would create a sort of an emotional distance, a social distance that was not dissimilar from the distance of Britain in the metropole trying to govern the North American colonies. So the response to that from the nationalists and the architects of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, was that those limits on serving in office were dismissing men of particular talent and experience, and limiting the stability and the insights that they might bring to government. And so there are no term limits in the Constitution. The term limit on the president and the vice president was introduced in 1951. So Washington served only 2 terms, and the power of his influence was so great that it was not until FDR during World War II era, that any president thought to serve more than 2 terms. And then FDR was elected to a 4th. He died in office. And that led to an amendment that codified a term limit for the president. But there, of course, is no, the justices still serve for life. There are no term limits on people serving in the House of Representatives. I saw last week that Chuck Grassley from Iowa, who's, I believe, 88 years old, and has served, is it 6 terms already in the Senate, is going to run again. Or maybe he served 5 terms already and is going to run again. So it's going to make, 48, if he wins, and he almost certainly will win, it's 48 years in the Senate if he lives out that term. And that's not even the longest serving senator in the history of the Senate. So, the question, I think, is whether a person acquires experience that is valuable, or whether a person acquires entitlement and becomes corrupt that is undermining of the interest of their constituents.
Very good. You handled that very delicately. Woody would have just said, it's elite. it's an elite conspiracy. And he's not completely wrong. Edward chimed in with a very good question. I think he might have been inspired by your pie charts and wondered, when we think about the weaknesses of the Constitution, I think a lot of people are identifying the Senate these days and sort of that disparity of representation between the states, which ends up reproducing itself in the Electoral College, of course.
Right.
And I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that situation and whether there's any way out.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'd have to leave it to a political scientist to really understand what's going on in the Senate today and offer any counsel. I would just say that the one of the concerns about representation in the Philadelphia meeting was about the future of the small states. And so there were compromises made between the large states, that's sort of large in population and large in geography and also influence, to gain the support of the smaller states, and mostly in terms of a population. And so the Senate is one way of doing that, but then it does get duplicated with the Electoral College. The other thing that gets duplicated with the Electoral College, and hopefully we'll have time to look at some of this in a source base, is the 3/5 compromise, which applies to the House of Representatives, intentionally exaggerates the influence of slaveholding states. And because the number of electors in a state is the number of senators plus the number of representatives, there is an exaggerated influence of the slaveholding states in choosing the president as well, and in setting policy. And there are other sort of factors as well. But not to get into the antebellum period, but sometimes we think about the tension between the North and the South as being over slavery. But my understanding is that there's tension between the North and the South over slave power, the exaggerated power that slaveholding states have in the House of Representatives, in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court at that time was based on districts, and in the electoral processes, and how that played out in the West. And so, I think that's another important thing to keep in mind in terms of the disproportionate power of small states in the Senate.
Very, very good. Yeah, that's a tough issue. And I think you're right about how inequities and discrimination kind of reproducing itself over time, which we've seen in different eras of American history.
Right.
So maybe we have time for one more before your great documents. We want to leave enough time for that. And we have a really great question from David about the vice presidency and what thought, if any, was put into that. And the fact that it has characteristics of both the executive and legislative branch. And I think partly for that reason, George Washington didn't include the vice president in his cabinet because
Yes.
I don't think he was entirely sure it was even in his branch of government.
Well, the vice presidency raises concerns among the critics of the Constitution because the Constitution is pitched as this way of balancing different interests in different branches of government, and it's not really clear when you read the Constitution which branch of government the vice president is really a part of. And then, of course, they certainly didn't understand how partisanship would factor into the selection of the president and the vice president. And one of the earliest changes that is made after the Bill of Rights is separating the selection of the vice president from the selection of the president. And that's because of, I guess we can blame Aaron Burr for that. It's I'm not sure. I'm trying to reflect back on the debates, which I have read. I'm not sure there's a lot of conversation in the Philadelphia debates about the vice president. I don't think there's a lot of anticipation of the trouble the office would present during ratification and then during the early federal period. But I don't know, Denver, do you have a clearer memory of the convention debates about how much they even talked about the vice presidency?
Yeah, I don't think it comes up very much. And I think the reason why is maybe another, I don't know if you want to call it an inherent weakness or oversight of the Constitution, and the fact that they didn't anticipate political parties. And so that kind of gets to the problem with the election of 1800 and the need for the 12th Amendment. It's strange that they just didn't anticipate that. They were so focused on the balancing the branches,
yes,
kind of in the old British way of thinking, which is understandable. That was their world, but they didn't anticipate a world in which, one political party could get control of all three branches, and so it didn't matter.
Right. And where people would have an allegiance to and an identity with a political party that would supersede all other considerations.
That's right. Yeah. So I don't think that's something that just, I guess we can't expect everything out of these guys.
No.